Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. My name is Peter Bella, and I'm delighted to have been asked to talk again about climate change, this time to focus on climate justice. Because time today is so short, I will not have the chance to recap the fundamentals of climate change science. Suffice it to say, this image taken by Apollo astronauts shows the thin atmosphere on Earth about 10 miles deep from the Earth's surface up to the top of the troposphere, and we're filling it with excess greenhouse gases. The accumulated amount of greenhouse gas pollution traps as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs going off every 24 hours all around the world. This is causing a huge amount of damage. The greenhouse gases are coming from the burning of fossil fuels in transportation and energy production, mining, agriculture, particularly animal agriculture, the burning and clearing of forests, the thawing of the permafrost, and other sources. As the impacts and the physical extent of climate change events increase, you'll begin to see a pattern of interconnections. So we're about to talk about changes within global systems once an element within an interconnected system reaches a tipping point. Global-scale climate justice challenges arise when interconnected climate systems reach a tipping point where human beings live. This graphic contains the elements you'll see in an upcoming video clip. First, let's look at the legend in the lower left-hand corner of the graphic. At the top of the legend, you'll notice the icons for regional elements and for global elements. Tipping points in global systems cascade due to the interconnectivity of global elements at risk. Those global elements are shown in the solid circles, color-coded as you see in the legend by the likelihood of reaching a tipping point as global average temperatures increase due to climate change. As we approach an average global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, those global elements shown with a solid red circle background become most likely. Let's look briefly at the red-colored global elements listed as the Greenland ice sheet, Labrador-Erminger Seas convection, and the West Antarctic ice sheet. In the Earth's polar regions, ocean water forms sea ice. Ice locked up in glaciers and the polar ice caps is fresh water. As ice forms from freezing seawater, the salt is left behind in the surrounding ocean. As the cold seawater gets saltier, its density increases and it starts to sink. Surface water is pulled in to replace the sinking water, which in turn eventually becomes cold and salty enough to sink. This initiates the deep ocean currents, driving the global ocean conveyor belt. Eventually, the water gets pulled back up towards the surface and warms up in a process called upwelling, completing the cycle. In the Atlantic, off the Florida coast, you can see the Gulf Stream, part of this circulatory system. But if the planet continues to warm, fresh water from melting ice at the poles would slow or even stop this circulation, due in part to reductions in the concentration of salt in the ocean near the freezing seawater, which would in turn slow the sinking of the cold, salty seawater, as well as due to a slowing of ocean ice formation. Regarding the catastrophic melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, I'll steal a slide from my April 2022 presentation to this group. In December 2021, scientists reported that the Thwaites Glacier will likely collapse in the next 5 to 10 years. Thwaites Glacier is comparable in size to Great Britain or Florida. The nickname America's Doomsday Glacier is given to Thwaites because if the ice shelf collapses, then the enormous volumes of ice held back by Thwaites are free to funnel into the glacier bed, no longer restrained from accelerating into the ocean by Thwaites. The scientists say that if Thwaites itself were to melt, then global sea levels would rise about 2 feet. If the Thwaites Glacier and other critical neighboring glaciers cannot hold back the West Antarctic ice sheet, global sea level could rise about 10.8 feet, affecting coastlines around the world. With that background in mind, I'd like to present a brief excerpt from a presentation given during the February 18th, 2023 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland.
These are the 16 tipping elements, the large biophysical systems that we have scientific evidence that it regulates the state of the entire climate system on Earth. 9 of these 16 are showing signs of instability. Push them too far, and they will shift over from supporting humanity to starting to undermine humanity. 2 of them, the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet, together represent 10 meters sea level rise. This shows scientifically that 1.5 degrees Celsius is a physical limit. It is not a political target. Here's the one that is most researched. Greenland ice sheet, accelerated melting, warming 4 times faster than the planet as a whole, releasing cold fresh water, slowing down the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, pushing the whole monsoon system down further south, causing droughts and forest fires over the Amazon rainforest, one more tipping element system, locking warm surface water in the Southern Ocean, accelerating the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. The North Pole is connected to the South Pole in regulating the stability of the entire Earth system. Dear friends, scientifically, this is not a climate crisis. We are now facing something deeper. Mass extinction, air pollution, undermining ecosystem functions, really putting humanity's future at risk. This is a planetary crisis.
Many areas of the world are now uninhabitable. This uninhabitable zone is increasing. If we continue with our greenhouse gas emissions, then by 2070, as many as 3 billion people will live in uninhabitable zones due to extreme temperature. Of course, climate disasters do not seek out the impoverished. As I switch slides, please keep your eye on the intense red zones denoting future uninhabitability. When we look at the global distribution of poverty, we are looking at people without the resources to adapt to disasters. That lack of resources is shared across the poor countries. Multidimensional poverty is defined as being deprived in a range of health, education, and living standard indicators. The intensity is the share of indicators in which the multidimensionally poor are deprived on average. So climate impact forecasts show these least able to recover from climate impacts are due to suffer temperature extremes, which will make their homes unlivable. But the risk is hardly limited to temperatures higher than the human body can tolerate. By late August 2022, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater from floods. The blue to black colors in the image illustrate where the land is underwater. Researchers have stated that climate change likely increased extreme monsoon rainfall, flooding highly vulnerable communities in Pakistan. Climate justice begins with the observation that those least responsible for climate change are often those who will be most harmfully impacted by climate change, as we have just seen. In this way, climate justice is rooted in deep inequities, social, economic, and in gross terms, influential inequities. The history of slavery stretches back untold generations before us, but to me is surely the most graphic example of exploitation by the powerful over the less powerful. This is what I mean when I talk about influential inequities, power and its uses, and the history of nation-to-nation conquest, with one group of people benefiting by the extraction of natural resources like minerals and timber, and by exploiting the physical, muscular strength of enslaved human beings, shows these resources have benefited the powerful, providing them comfort and luxury, and in a modern setting have made them responsible for climate pollution. The wealth and the industrialization of the West clearly go hand in hand, so it comes as no surprise that the rich industrialized countries are the greatest polluters. So to many in the climate justice movement, the throttling back of the traditional economic engines which produce pollution should start in the West. These so-called developing countries, those with the lowest standard of living, should not be penalized in the drive to improve their own lives. Above all, a technical solution which will slow or mitigate climate pollution must not harm poor communities. For example, given an industrial project which intends to create hydrogen for use as a pollution-free fuel when burned, if the project itself creates carbon emissions and harms vulnerable neighborhoods, then it is unacceptable. While climate science invariably focuses on the future, climate justice brings the past with it. This fact may be lost to audiences considering the global scale of climate impacts, as world history is not well known by many, especially seen through the lens of climate justice. However, in the United States, our own history and current struggles deeply inform the climate justice challenge in this country. According to NOAA, since 1980, the U.S. has sustained at least 341 weather and climate disasters where overall damages reached or exceeded $1 billion. The total cost of these 341 events exceeds $2.4 trillion. This graphic illustrates $18 billion events just last year. With increasing risks of impact due to climate change, every American faces the potential for costs due to climate. But with sharp income inequality and rising costs due to inflation, rebuilding a home may be out of reach for some who own a home destroyed by a climate event. Rebuilding a life after a climate disaster may be out of reach for those on the lowest income levels. But this is hardly the full story of climate justice in the United States. As we discussed last year, science says oceans warmed by climate change make ocean-based storms much stronger. One recent example in the Western Hemisphere is Hurricane Ida, which went over waters in the Gulf of Mexico that were 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. Ida went on to impact Louisiana heavily. According to Inside Climate News, nearly a month after Hurricane Ida churned through a vast network of offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico and then spun over refineries, chemical plants, and hundreds of other industrial sites alone, authorities still do not know how much pollution the powerful Category 4 storm unleashed. They probably never will. Ida caused at least 28 deaths in Louisiana, many of them heat-related, during an extended power outage. With 150-mile-an-hour gale force winds, it also tied with the last island hurricane of 1856 for the strongest maximum sustained winds on record at landfall in this state. Some of the country's most distressed communities were in Ida's path. 35.2% of the population lives in a distressed community. 5.1% lives in a prosperous community as defined by the Economic Innovation Group. Their Distressed Communities Index gauges well-being across 7 different metrics covering education, poverty, incomes, work, housing vacancy, job growth, and business openings. Distressed communities tend to lag behind their peers on all fronts. As a consequence, they are often the least resilient in the face of natural disasters, economic dislocations, or other public health crises. But then we need to talk about Cancer Alley. ProPublica published a map they call the most detailed map of cancer-causing industrial air pollution in the U.S. ProPublica's analysis of 5 years of modeled EPA data identified more than 1,000 toxic hotspots across the United States, including this one. They estimated that the highest risk of incremental lifetime cancer risk in Cancer Alley was 1 in 210, or 47 times the EPA's acceptable risk. Cancer Alley stretches from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, is one of the greatest hotspots for cancer cases in the United States, and is home to over 150 chemical plants. But there's one more overlay to go. Slavery. According to the National Humanities Center, in 1860, 4 million people of African descent lived in the United States and were enslaved. By the Civil War, Louisiana had about 1,600 plantations large enough to have at least 50 slaves working on each. Very few Louisiana plantations have survived. A handful are listed on this tourist map distributed by the state of Louisiana. Only one, the Whitney Plantation, is dedicated to telling the story of slavery. Climate justice is inextricably tied to environmental justice, social justice, and racial justice all along the Gulf Coast of the United States. Louisiana has its strong share of climate justice groups, many run by descendants of enslaved peoples. Because my background is technical and analytical when focusing on pollution and its causes, I remember hearing about climate justice and not understanding. I thought, don't they understand that we need to prioritize stopping carbon emissions to save the planet? 2 points. 1, we cannot expect those carrying generational trauma with them to lay that aside and prioritize scientific, technical mitigation strategies. Part of the generational trauma is caused by their realities and lived experiences never having been prioritized by those in power, always falling to some level of need that has never been met, even if even recognized at all. I don't think we can expect them to recognize the global mobilization needed to tackle climate change, simply shrug and say, okay, we'll take a back seat on the bus again. 2, we share the same goals, and in fighting the proximate causes, such as the build-out of the Texas coast for oil and gas export, or the building of pipelines across the state to carry oil and gas, or the dredging of coastal Superfund sites to enable very large crude carriers shipping ports for oil and gas export, they fight to protect their communities, families, and livelihoods, as well as fight the development of oil and gas infrastructure. Everyone fighting to stop or slow or reverse the climate crisis is not just fighting to protect their communities, families, and livelihoods. They are fighting use of fossil fuel to power the world, and so they fight the build-out of fossil fuel infrastructure, the investment in which simply means more years of carbon and toxic pollution, because we continue to rely on fossil fuels. Here at home, we also continue to have important climate fights on our own hands, with some victories. The CPS Energy Board of Trustees recently approved that the Spruce Power Plant, owned by CPS Energy, will end the burning of coal in 2027-2028 timeframe. But plans currently anticipate retooling the plant to burn liquefied natural gas. Not good enough. We also have inequities to address in San Antonio and Bexar County, indicated by discrepancies in life expectancy and income equality. However great the immediacy is to stop greenhouse gas pollution globally and at home, those fighting for climate justice here can't be expected to remain silent and simply fight climate pollution alone. And so we return to the cradle. I hope I leave you with a feeling of immediacy in addressing the climate crisis and with a deeper understanding of what climate justice is, but more importantly, why it is. Thank you for your time and attention.